What do you mean that something had to be done? You mean to stop the abuse in the system or the very high numbers of international students entering the country being driven by demand? Or do you mean for something to stop it, as in that the government wasn't doing enough?
I mean, I think, sure, you know, the talk of the bad actors and the abuse of the system, there was surely some of that, but I think it's mostly the numbers. I think the growth was just so dramatic, and I think that the sense was we needed to kind of pull the emergency brake.
So you're saying the crisis started in about 2020 to 2022 when the government started making decisions to make it easier for persons to enter Canada on an international study permit?
I mean, put it this way: when I was working in the Ontario government, we made a decision back around 2017 to wind down the public-private college partnership program, and the subsequent government kind of wound it back up. But even then, we knew there were some problems in the system. So, I mean, I think things go that far back, maybe further.
And do you know if your organization was consulted before the immigration changes were announced?
We were not consulted.
Not consulted. Do you support then making the cap permanent?
I do, yeah.
Would you support the cap being made permanent on master's and PhD students as well?
I mean, I think I need to understand better how it's applied, but I think the key point would be, I think the federal government should be very clear in providing their allocations to the provinces and largely defer to the provinces in terms of how they want to make the allocations available both to their institutions and for the fields of study or the types
Sorry, Mr. Cote, I'm going to interrupt you.
Sure.
You talked about the trust for prospective international students. What about the trust of Canadians? You've seen a very fast drop in support amongst Canadian citizens and permanent residents for immigration, and the immigration consensus has been destroyed in Canada. So how should the government keep the trust of Canadians that they're actually running an immigration levels and immigration system for their benefit instead of for the benefit of those who are, frankly, outside of Canada at the moment?
I mean, I think efforts now need to be made to rebuild that trust, frankly. I think it's heartening that there's some resilience in public sentiments, but I think you're right that it has fallen, and so I think this is part of a broader package of reforms to get things back on track, but I think this will be a longer-term thing.
You point out that international student enrollment in Ontario has grown by 342% in less than a decade. So Ontario accounts for nearly 75% of the international college student enrollment. Do you think that this growth is sustainable?
Well, first off, I want to thank you for reading the article. I wasn't sure whether anyone had. Do I think that growth is sustainable? No, absolutely not. And I think, I think the situation looked different in different parts of the country. I think it was most concentrated in the Ontario college sector and reflected in that growth. And I think, that was a major contributor to sort of needing to pull the emergency brake here.
You outline a number of recommendations for the Government of Ontario in that article. So before I address them specifically, I would like to ask, do you have any indication the province is acting on the areas of concern you have identified in that?
I mean, well, so firstly, we've been in some dialogue with the Ontario, Ministry of Colleges and Universities, and also I think in terms of some of their public announcements, they have come out and said they're going to be tightening the screws on public-private college partnerships, which received a lot of attention. So they have signaled that they're going to sort of seek to make some changes. But I think, what we get into in the article is, oversight of DLIs, for example, is by and large a provincial responsibility, or it should be. And my co-author on this work we're going to put out likes to call it, and he was an ADM in the Ontario government that oversaw the international student program. He liked to call the DLI policy the lobster trap. Where basically once an institution was approved as a DLI, there was very little oversight beyond. So we outlined some recommendations for beefing up, for provinces to beef up oversight of DLIs. And you might have other questions, so maybe I'll pause there.
Yes, so because giving an indication is a different thing, but has the Government of Ontario started acting on any of those recommendations? Whether it is DLIs or any other, have they started acting?
Not that I'm aware of.
My next question is, you identify the need to improve the designated learning institutions program, and that's, could you outline the shortcomings with this program in Ontario and how you think the province can improve it?
Sure. I mean, I think that, so I think thinking about quality assurance for designated learning institutions and how it is tracked, how it is reported. So there are a whole bunch of mechanisms there. And I think that includes recruitment practices, where we've seen some major challenges. So how to put in place firmer standards, safeguards around recruitment overseas. In terms of the actual student experience while on the ground here in Canada, so how are provincial governments overseeing DLIs to ensure that international students are having a sort of a satisfactory experience, are treated well. I think student supports is a big one. Obviously, there's been a big focus on housing, but also around employment. Those have been big issues. Academic supports, and a variety of other factors. And I think, you know, some of the work we've done with international students, it is a major life leap to head to an entirely different country and sort of seek to pursue your education and potentially your life in this place. And I think we haven't necessarily done enough to ensure that our institutions are providing the supports and kind of the safeguards for those students while they're here.
Address the issue of the third-party recruiters, usually overseas, that makes many misleading or false promises to recruit the international students to Ontario institutions. Given issues of borders and jurisdiction, what could provincial and the federal governments do to address these issues? How can we control that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there are examples from various jurisdictions of codes of practice. I think that you know what one aspect is you know, anecdotally, but I think there's been enough evidence of this. We've heard that recruiters, and it won't just be third-party recruiters, have made basically express commitments to students that becoming an international student in Canada would put them on this pathway to citizenship. So really, you know, sort of falsely presenting the kind of the immigration pathway opportunity there. So there could certainly be sort of beefed up requirements in terms of ensuring that you know, recruiters are sort of singing off the same song sheet as they're out engaging with students. And I'm sure some of my other witnesses might have some thoughts on this as well.
Thank you to our witnesses who are here this evening. And this is rare, but I appreciate the questions from my colleague, Mr. Kmich. I noticed that none of you were consulted when the federal government was putting in place these measures. I think that's worth noting. Mr. Jacob, you spoke about pan-Canadian measures in your opening remarks. You agree with some of these measures, but when there's a whole of Canada approach, isn't that a little bit risky? Because it can paper over the differences between certain regions or certain provinces. Can you speak on that, please? Yes. So I wasn't really talking about whole of Canada measures. I wanted to talk about the whole of Canada impacts of these measures on nursing programs across Canada. It is clear that when we look into the data, there's a lot of variability between one region and another, and one academic institution and another. So I think for that reason, the government should look at the needs of different provinces. Take Quebec for one example. Quebec is a francophone province, which comes with certain needs. There's the needs of the Anglophone population to take into account as well. So there's a conversation that has to be had about that. Back in January, the minister put in place measures related to the open work permit for spouses of students. Then the program was changed so that it would only apply to people in law schools, medicine schools, graduate schools, and postgraduate schools. Of course, that was changed later on. And it was all to make it, this was to take into account that nurses from abroad often come with a spouse and children. This was a whole of Canada, so that was a whole of Canada measure focused on certain Ontario colleges, but it had a negative impact on certain provinces, would it not? Yes, that's true. I would like to talk about another subject brought up by certain ambassadors from African countries. I spoke to ambassadors from Morocco, Cote d'Ivoire, and other countries. They said, be careful when you go to recruit a bunch of African nurses because it will create a bit of a brain drain. These countries are finding that there is a shortage of nurses in their territories. Is there an ethical question to be raised here? Certainly. You've touched on a few points there. First, there's the people that we recruit into entry programs, so they're not nurses already in their country, but they still that still draws people from the recruitment pools abroad. This gets into the topic of ethical student recruitment and consideration for other countries. We don't necessarily want to eviscerate the resources of other countries, so there needs to be a balance between international ethics and domestic considerations. Thank you, Mr. Patel. I admired your opening remarks. In November 1st, 2024, people from public colleges were said not to be eligible for postgraduate work permits unless their field of study was linked to a long-term labor need. We heard that there's a lot of public college programs that could be wiped out by this change. The federal government was supposed to better align the labor market needs and the immigration system. Do you agree with the postgraduate work permit reforms?
I do not agree with the postgraduate work reforms as they currently stand because they don't necessarily line up with the labor market needs of the particular regions and have unintended impacts on local rural economies. So, for example, the tourism sector, we have a number of major games happening here in Vancouver. We need to make sure we have enough people to be serve that need, and we know that that need is not going to be filled by our domestic students alone, that we need to have immigrants or international students fill that labor market need. So that's one just specific example. So I would love to have that reconsideration.
J'ai envie de vous poser la même question à M. Patel.
I would now like to ask Mr. Patel the same question as I asked Mr. Jacob regarding the whole of Canada approach. In your opening remarks, you spoke about how important it was for the federal government to consult provinces and various stakeholders. A whole of Canada approach. Well, do you believe that a whole of Canada approach should be modified to take into account the needs of different regions?
I believe that we need to take, I do believe that we need to take into account the specific regional needs. In British Columbia specifically, I can speak to the fact that the provincial government has been proactive with the public institutions here around tuition transparency, student support, a 30% cap on international students, a code of practice for third-party recruiters. So that's just some examples that the provincial government has put into policy on public post-secondary. And so I do think there needs to be more consultation directly with the stakeholders involved.
Thank you very
Merci.
much. Thank you. And now we will go to MP Kwan for 6 minutes. Please go ahead, MP Kwan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for their presentations. I want to just sort of get a little bit into the notion that the government did no consultation with any of you. But to that point, with respect to the cap, When we're talking about what the implications are for Canada on the whole, but also for different regions, and then, of course, into the specific sectors in terms of the labor needs. And so my first question would be to Mr. Jacob, to the point to the healthcare sector. Do you have any information or data on what your projection is in terms of Canada's need in the healthcare sector to meet the labor demands?
In terms of nursing workforce?
Yeah.
I would be able to get you those numbers. What I shared with you were mostly for the education sector. I represent mostly the educational institutions. But of course, it is to meet the growing shortage. We do know that the shortage has been there for quite some time, and we've been trying to catch up. But I can definitely get you some specific numbers if you'd like to.
Yes, if you could do that, that would be, I think, very useful, because one of the questions that I have for the minister, of course, is have they actually done a full economic analysis and the implications for Canada on the whole, and of course, the analysis on the labor demands. So if you have any information related to that, that would be very useful. Can I ask the same question to Mr. Patel?
Hi, thank you. No, in BC, we have a labor market outlook that's put out by our own provincial government of a decade outlook that shows you what jobs can be filled by Canadian or permanent residents or migration within Canada, and then what jobs are going to have to be filled by those outside of Canada. And that is issued annually, and I can certainly forward that to the committee based on what I can determine as the analysis of the postgrad work permit eligibility. That was not considered in this context.
Thank you. That would be very useful, just so that we have that on record as well. Now, to the question around CAP, and I believe Mr. Patel and Mr. Jacob, you both answered to say as long as it meets needs. Can you actually be more specific about what you mean by needs, and can you define needs? Do you mean labor market needs? What does that mean exactly? Because some people might interpret it to mean something else. So let's start with Mr. Jacob, and then we'll come to Mr. Patel.
To one of your colleagues, there are the needs of the industry in terms of healthcare, but there's also the educational needs or education sector needs. So we need to look at projection of needed PhDs and masters for education, but masters for clinical as well. So there's different avenues. So I think there needs to be a very detailed analysis of what that would look like. So when I'm thinking of a cap, I think I'm responding to the need to have things on, for ethical recruitment, some very clear parameters to bring students in from international. But also it's to meet the needs of our healthcare sector and our academic institutions.
Thank you. Mr. Patel, on the same question?
I would define needs as working with ourselves and the BC government in identifying what our labor market needs are in specific regions, so that the government, the provincial government that is, has some autonomy to ask public post-secondary to ensure that we are training the workforce that will meet those labor market needs, and taking into consideration how that need will be filled between domestic students and non-domestic residents.
Mr. Patel, can you elaborate on the implications of this public policy now for VCC specifically? I'm aware that actually in the news, VCC Faculty Association has already mentioned that there will be layoffs. So what are the implications both from a staff point of view as well as access to programs for both domestic and international students?
At this point, we have not announced any layoffs. We are just monitoring our enrollment in hopes that we can minimize any employment impact. We do anticipate the declining numbers would have impact on not just providing programs that fit the labor market needs, as I addressed earlier, but potentially some of those revenues that we have to better support our other diverse student body, particularly the programs for blind, deaf, hard hearing, visually impaired, and a number of the programs that we have for our new immigrants. So many institutions use the net revenue from international students to help support some of those program areas, but the biggest hit could be in the area of the labor market.
Around implications. I know that you were not consulted. Were you made aware of what the government's goal is with respect to their announcement at any point in time? So first to Mr. Jake, but then Mr. Patel.
I'm not aware of any of that information being shared.
Mr. Patel?
I'm not aware of any information being shared other than there was supposed to be a cap on international student numbers, but no consultation.
There's the issue about differences in regions, provinces, and so on. Now, there are some issues with respect to international students, especially with the bad actors, meaning that people who are fraudulently engaged in bringing international students to Canada with both consultants as well as potentially involvement with the institutions, and particularly those from the private sector. So my quick question to Mr. Patel is there a difference between provinces, and is the government's approach to addressing this, using this sort of broad scope approach, ineffective?
I can only speak on behalf of the province of BC, and we do have amongst the public post-secondary codes of practice and standards that we follow if we use third party. I know that is not consistent across the country.
About 6 minutes left, so I think we'll go 2-2 and 1-1. So 2 minutes, 2-2, 1-1. Okay, so you know what I mean. 2 minutes to Conservative, 2 to Liberals, 1 NDP and Bloc. Okay, so before I waste any more time, I will go to Mr. Redikoff for 2 minutes, please.
Larry.
Oh, Larry, my friend. Mr. Mugoyer, go ahead for 2 minutes.
Mr. Cote, you, I'm just going to first of all go, you weren't consulted, Mr. Jacobs. There's an urgent demand here across Canada for skilled workers in the crucial sectors, including health. So can you explain how has this uncertainty caused by the abrupt changes announced by the Liberals, government created an impact in Canada's reputation as a destination for top talent? You mentioned the master's and the PhD students, but can you just elaborate on that?
For the reputation itself?
Yeah.
I can only speak to the effects. So what we're seeing is decreased enrollment, right?
So you're doing that out of decreased enrollment.
Right.
What other impacts would you see in regards to that as well? Is there, what are your number of students going to look like?
Well, what we've seen is, there are multiple, right? Multiple impacts. So when you're looking at the functioning of any academic institution, they're not in silos. So if you're going to affect the budget of the universities or colleges, you will see that all sectors will be affected, including nursing. So, there's if you're looking at the college sector with the PSW programs that have been affected by these international caps, they end up affecting the number of faculty that are available within the different departments. And, we're looking at not being able to deliver as many nurses as we would like to in terms of responding to the needs.
Maybe I'll ask Mr. Patel, what do you see as a reputation here? How do you describe the Liberals' motivation in addressing this? And could they have better policy choices in the past to avoid the outcome that we've seen today?
I think if we had gone through a more comprehensive consultation process and been able to work collectively with the province and institutions, we might, I think Andre references that would get us to a better place. Just on the ground, when you speak to our folks that are overseas, like our staff that fly overseas, the Canada brand has taken a significant hit, and it's going to take some time to rebuild that reputation back up as a study destination and a high-quality education destination.
We'll go to now Mr. Ali. Mr. Ali, 2 minutes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. My question is to Mr. Cote. With international students accounting for a significant share of tuition revenue in Ontario's post-secondary institutions, do you think the federal government's reform will help to reduce the risk associated with over-reliance on this revenue stream?
Well, I mean, I think it will force a reduction in the over-reliance on that revenue stream. I think we're already starting to see some of the cracks in the system as a result of the fall off in international student numbers. So with certain colleges announcing campus closures, and I think we're just at the beginning of what's going to happen. But I also think this was just not sustainable, and also we're not providing solid outcomes for many of these learners, and we were giving them a bit of a false bill of goods in terms of their opportunity to stay here in Canada. So something had to be done.
Thank you. Your report mentions the need for a strategic approach to integrating international students into the economy and society. Do you see the federal government's reform as laying the groundwork for more balanced education sector?
Well, I mean, I think, and international education strategies going back a decade or so have focused on this idea of alignment to labor market, to filling labor market needs, and so obviously that's a priority in terms of these federal reforms. I think it's just, and really, I agreed with what Mr. Patel was saying. It's really about the way or the mechanism for going about it, especially around this connection to postgraduate work permit eligibility for college programs. I feel like that is something that would be much better decided at a provincial level, where there's just a keener sense of local labor market needs and demands, and that capability for, sort of setting it at that level, as opposed to nationally, where it's really a blunt instrument.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Ali. Sorry.
Thank you, Chair.
2 minutes, 10 seconds. So thank you. So we will go to Mr. Bruno for 1 minute, please.
Just 1 minute, okay. Mr. Cote, you caught my attention when you spoke about a failure of federalism. That really spoke to me. I think you are saying what everyone else is saying. I'd like to hear you talk about how the federal government not only does not consult stakeholders, but also about whether it should perhaps let provinces make more decisions.
Merci
Thank you for that question.
In English, just because I'll be able to go quicker. I mean, I think, and I think we've been seeing this in many areas, but you see the way that like this is a jointly managed system, the international student program, and yet you have this situation where the federal government felt compelled to take these sort of unilateral steps without adequate consultation with stakeholders, but also, from what I can gather, with provinces. And I just do not feel like we will be capable of properly sort of reforming and fixing the system if we do not have better coordination between the federal and provincial territorial governments, a clear sort of division of labor, whether it's overseeing DLIs, whether it's putting in place the standards or requirements around international recruitment, when we're using kind of a common brand Canada, obviously differentiated for certain provinces or certain institutions. But I just have a very hard time seeing how we're going to repair the system without a much more coordinated approach.
Thank you very much. We will go to MP Kwan. MP Kwan, 1 minute, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Jacob. Any recommendations that you would want to make to the government?
Make sure that you look at what happens to the schools of nursing. If you're going to increase the numbers or ask to increase the numbers in the schools, the resources need to follow. And if you end up cutting within the academic institutions for those types of programs, you're not going to get the output that you're looking for.
I think we've heard from all the witnesses about the lack of consultation and the importance of coordination and working together. Would you recommend that the government pause this plan and begin that work now so that we can get it right? Just a quick answer from all the witnesses.
I say yes.
Okay, go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Patel. Mr. Cote?
I don't think it can be paused, but I think there's no reason the government couldn't step in now and say, we're going to be thinking long term, and we're going to be convening, consulting around a new long-term strategy together.
Mr. Jacob?
I would agree with more consultation, absolutely.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the committee members, I would love to thank Mr. Patel, Mr. Kote, and Mr. Jacob for your time and input to the committee. Thank you. With that, we will suspend for 5 minutes for the next round of witnesses. Here we go. Members, we will start with Mr. Kimmich for 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. So just to the witnesses, I'm going to be going quickly through some questions. So if you keep your answers short, then I'll have to not interrupt you as often. Just like in the last round, we'll start with the provost of SFU. Sir, were you consulted on the immigration levels, on the immigration changes announced by the government for the international student program?
No.
Do you agree with the temporary cap?
No.
Would you agree to making the cap permanent?
No.
Do you agree with the cap on master's students and PhD students?
No.
In the case of your institution, how often does IRCC check with you on the status of international students?
I would have to get back to you on that question, but not very often.
If you could check with the registrar's office in your institution and get back to the committee, that would be much appreciated.
Yes.
And then I would like to know as well, does IRCC check with your institution that students have paid 1 full year of tuition before issuing them their study permit?
No.
They don't check?
Not that I'm aware. Not that. No, I have to get back to you, but not that I'm aware.
Okay, if you could provide it to committee, that would be very valuable information for us to have. I wanted to move on next now to the Higher Education Strategy Associates. I wanted to ask the same questions. Were you consulted on the changes announced by the government?
No, we were not.
Do you support the cap?
I do.
If the cap became permanent, would you support that as well?
It would depend on the conditions of the cap.
Okay, so I'll take that as a yes, but with conditions. Do you...
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président. Je pense que...
Sorry, there is a difficulty.
Our interpreters don't seem to be able to hear the witness, as I understand it.
Oh, OK. Parfait, c'est beau, c'est réglé. Merci.
Elle était d'accord avec le plafond, puis j'allais lui demander sur le plafond en permanence. Are we okay to continue, Chair?
Yes.
I still have the rest of that time?
I only have 42 seconds
kindly.
gone yet. Only
Perfect.
not much. So you have 4 minutes still.
So I was going to continue asking you, would you support the cap was permanent? You said if it became permanent with conditions, depending how they would do it. Would you support the cap on master's and PhD students?
No.
Okay, before I go on to the Bar Association, I did want to ask you, because I'm on your website, I do read Alex Usher quite often, and I'm sure you know I was going to ask you about this. Can you comment on this particular statement that he made? Now, of course, Justin Trudeau is at the ready to back up his minister with some truly odious crocodile tears. Immigration is great, he said. We just want to punish bad actors. This is ludicrous. The government is in no way, shape, or form going after specific bad actors. It is going after the entire sector. Whether this is cruelty or stupidity, I leave to readers to decide, but Trudeau's explanation holds no water. The only possible justification for the approach the feds have taken here is that it's a national problem. This is in quotations. It isn't, but that's another story. But we have to let provinces find their own solution to the problem of bad actors. This is at least is a constitutionally correct attitude, but it's a very different one from the Prime Minister's claim. Could you please explain who are the bad actors in your view?
I can't speak on behalf of what Mr. Usher has written. He writes his blog without our input. But I would argue that the bad actors are the people who have been able to kind of exploit international students well beyond what their capacity in their communities are. Even, for example, if you look at institutions who have brought in hundreds, even thousands of international students well beyond what their funding needs are, I would consider them to be the bad actors in this situation.
I'll move on to the Bar Association now. You've heard me ask the others. I'm going to ask you the same thing. Were you consulted before these changes were announced?
I can only speak from my own personal experience. No, we can't. I can't express on behalf of the Canadian Bar Association the answer to that question. But I wasn't in my capacity.
And Madame Lalal, you're the chair of the National Immigration Section, so I'm going to ask you: were you consulted?
No direct consultation, although we have regular meetings with IRCC on various topics.
Do you support the temporary cap? Does your organization support the temporary cap?
We've yet to take a position on it. I think we're going to be taking some positions on it in the days to come and months to come.
Okay. Should the cap become permanent, would you take a position on that too? Would you support that?
Again, we are looking into this, and we will be doing submissions on this. We don't have a standing position on this.
So you wouldn't have a position either on master's and PhD students at all, whether they should be included in the cap or not?
Organizationally is different than individually. I think I'm allowed in my individual capacity to say I don't agree with a cap on master's and PhD students, but organizationally we haven't taken a position.
Okay. I'm going to ask the both of you, because you are lawyers, so you have specialty in immigration law that I do not have. In Annex 4 of the Immigration Levels Plan, because you had mentioned that some of these changes somewhat target also international students very directly on their path to permanent residency. So when I'm bringing the Immigration Levels Plan, because I think it's important, you specifically disagreed with the need to make international students reapply for a new study permit if they change their designated learning institute. You had other things you were concerned with. I wanted to ask you, then, in the plan, it calls for the voluntary removal from Canada, for people to voluntarily leave almost 1 million people over 2 years. How would the ministry do this legally? Like, what are their options to ensure that people leave voluntarily? When I asked this question from the minister, he couldn't answer me. So I'm wondering what 2 expert lawyers, specifically in immigration law, understand to be the methods to make people leave.
30 seconds to answer.
What we're seeing in practice are refusals of extensions or refusals of applications and delays on processing PR, really making applicants leave on their own. Do I think it's enough, personally, to remove that many individuals in this period of time? It's going to be a hard process. So I don't think it's anything in law that'll make it that easy, unless some sort of policy or program came in place or some announcement to make it a coordinated effort. But we're saying hold off on the coordinated effort until there's clear who's in and who's out of the new plans.
Thank you very much. And we will go to Parliamentary Secretary, Mr. Chang. 6 minutes yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me to ask questions. And I'd like to thank all the witnesses here today for committing your time to help us with the study. My first question is to the Canadian Bar Association. The government's decision to raise the financial threshold for study permit applicants aimed to ensure students are better prepared for life in Canada. How does this align with recommendations from your December 2023 letter to Minister Miller to safeguard international students against financial vulnerabilities?
So obviously there needs to be financial thresholds for students, but they have to be in keeping with abilities. And I believe our submissions have always been consistently that students need to be supported with resources once they come into Canada, with housing. They are paying premium tuition fees, and so housing and counselling and all those additional supports are what are essential.
You agree that financially they need to be secure before they get to Canada?
I think all students need to be financially secure, but the bigger part is Canada's role in supporting them once they are here,
right,
in terms of resources, counselling, as I've said, and housing.
Thank you. And you have highlighted concerns about the role of unscrupulous school recruiters and immigration consultants. How might the government's measure to limit visas for programs not eligible for post-graduation work permits, as well as its enhanced verification processes to deter fraudulent actors in the system?
Go ahead.
I mean, I think those are positive steps, but the reality is, even if the rules change, those who want to exploit the system and take advantage of it will adjust their efforts as well. And unfortunately, we're dealing with a lot of students from countries where Canada's relationships might not be the strongest right now. And our ability, for example, the Philippines was a great example where we were able to do some bilateral improvement to encourage Philippine authorities to take a bigger role in combating fraud in the Philippines. With India and China and other countries right now, it might be a much more difficult situation. So I don't think it's as easy as measures will change things. I think it takes a coordinated effort on many stages to achieve that.
Thank you for those answers. And are you referring that India and China will be a difficult country to work with?
I think it'll be extremely difficult to curb some of the practices. I think they're so long-standing in those countries, and I think that it will require an enhanced level of diplomatic effort to get to there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I'm turning over to the higher education person, how do you view the introduction of annual cap on study permits as a measure to stabilize international students' number? And do you see this as an effective way to address capacity challenges while maintaining institutional integrity?
Yes and no is the complicated answer to that. Yes, I do think it is a step to be able to help curb some of
I'm
the
sorry,
problems
Mr.
that
Chair. I cannot hear you. Could you speak up or?
Can you speak closer to the mic, please?
Hello, check one, check two.
Turn your mic off, then it is
Okay. Okay, go ahead, please.
Apologies. As I was saying, I think the answer to that is twofold. Yes, I do think it is a measure that will be effective. With that said, effective for whom and for what is a different story. I think as we've implemented kind of a broad stroke, one-size-fits-all measure, that doesn't particularly solve issues that are happening in other places. In fact, it might create them. So while it might be an effective measure to kind of curb some of the absorptive capacity of some of the areas that these schools are in, on the flip side of that, I think it will also lead to other problems that bringing in international students have been addressing over the past decade.
Thank you so much. My next question, the decision to enhance the use of designated learning institutes portal for issuing acceptance letter was partly influenced by concerns about fraudulent consultant practices. Do you believe this move will address such issues, and are there additional safeguards institutions and government should consider?
I'm not perfectly equipped to speak to that. We are a consultancy who works with institutions and are not in any form of recruiting. I do think the designated learning institutions are a first step in moving towards there, but I think there will be more steps that will have to be taken.
Would you recommend any of this additional steps that we could take to make this system more credible?
I could get back to you with recommendations, yes.
Great. Thank you so much for your answers. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. You have still a minute.
I will go ahead.
Okay?
Yep.
Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay. So how do you, thank you so much, how do you anticipate the changes limiting spousal work permit for undergraduate and college level international students will impact Canada's competitiveness in the global education market? That's for you, yes.
All right, thank you. I believe the places that will affect the most are the colleges and the college vocational schools that are offering their programming. Their students are traditionally older, participating in things that are directly related to our labor market as opposed to some more traditional undergraduate programming. So I think as a result of that, we'll see less demand in some of the programming that is high need, high demand, especially in vocational type programming.
Much, Mr. Chang.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We will go to Mr. Bruno de Sepp for 6 minutes. Please go ahead, Mr. Bruno de Sepp.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being with us tonight. Ms. McClellan, in your opening remarks, you said that a number of universities have been using international students to bring in more money because they've been underfunded by certain provinces. Is this true for all universities in Canada?
Madam McClellan, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's true of the system overall. I can't speak to the motivations between every single institution in the country. There's quite a few. But between each province, the funding for the post-secondary sector overall has been stagnant, with very minimal new money coming in on behalf of the governments. And while their costs continue to rise as an incredibly labor-intensive institution, that money has to be made up somewhere. So in places like Nova Scotia, where you have a 3% domestic student tuition cap, their hands have been quite tied, in lack of a better term. So, yeah.
Est-ce que vous connaissez le réseau des universités du...
Do you know about the Network of Quebec Universities, that organization?
Pardon, could you repeat that, translator?
Est-ce que vous connaissez...
Are you familiar with the Réseau des Universités du Québec, the organization?
I am familiar, but there are people in our office who are from Quebec and work in Quebec and have studied in Quebec, so I would not be the right person to
Parfait.
answer any particular.
Merci beaucoup, parce que je veux juste dire au comité, là...
Thank you, because I would just like to note for the committee, Quebec, the Réseau des Universités du Québec has more students than the University of Toronto. And we heard from the Réseau, they get $21 million for international students, but only $18 million for students from Quebec. So international students need to be taken into account. I imagine things are different elsewhere, but there's a major difference between what the Quebec Universities Network receives and what other schools receive. And this is why it's so important to talk about targeted measures instead of a whole-of-Canada approach, because there's a number of differences from one university to another, especially in Quebec, where our universities are in a network. Do you agree that we should move away from a whole-of-Canada approach?
Yes, I agree. I think targeted measures are the way to move forward.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, Mme McLennan.
Thank you, Ms. McLennan. For our friends from the Canadian Bar Association, what do you think about Mr. Miller's belief that immigration consultants are improperly advising students to request asylum? And what do you think about the infamous problems with immigration consultants that we hear so much about?
Thank you for that question. There is indeed, as we've been using the term bad actors in the system, and international students have been misguided and misled on a number of fronts. With respect to refugee claims, on that point alone, you have students here from countries where those countries are known to be refugee-producing countries. Can you hear me?
Okay, let Madame Lehel finish and then...
Allez-y. Non, je voulais juste savoir combien de temps il me restait.
No, go ahead. I was just trying to check how much time I had left. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, so
Okay.
With respect to students being guided to make refugee claims by consultants, that may indeed be something that's happening, but we also need to realize that students from a number of countries are coming from refugee-producing countries. There's human rights violations in a number of countries, such as Colombia, Nigeria, Ghana, China, India, all these countries. So there's a number of reasons why students may not, when they first come in, make a refugee claim. And they may have very legitimate reasons then to make a claim. You come in on a student permit, you don't have to deal with an uncertainty of making a refugee claim, which are complex, but there are circumstances now that may compel them to do that because the country conditions are such that...
Et que la situation au pays peut changer entre le moment où ils...
And things in their home country can change once they're already in Canada. After a year in Canada, maybe the situation back at home can change completely, and then that might drive them to claim asylum.
That's correct. Circumstances can change. Thank you. Sorry, just a bit of a delay.
Well, je sais, c'est welcome to my...
No, I get it. Welcome to my world.